Okay, good evening. Going to welcome you to the meeting for the Coeur d'Alene School District for June 22nd, 2020. Before we get going, I'll just introduce our participants up front for those in the audience or viewing at home. I'll start at my far right with Miss Rebecca Smith, board member, and Miss Lisa May, board member. To my immediate left is Miss Jennifer Brumley, our vice chair, and Miss Tambra Pickford, a board member. My name is Casey Morserow, and I'm our board chair. Also joining us tonight in the back to my left is Dr. Steve Cook, our superintendent, and on my right is Miss Lynn Town, our clerk of the board. Public comment is scheduled to start at the beginning of the meeting. Please sign in on the sheet provided at the entrance door. We may also receive comments in writing prior to this meeting or after the meeting. And those can be submitted through our board clerk. Okay. Is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda? Okay, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, thank you. Okay, so we will move on to our 2020-2021 budget hearing. And to do so, I need to go ahead and open the hearing. And Ms. Ebner, I will turn it over to you for your presentation. And then we'll do public comment after that.
Thank you, Chair Morserow, members of the board. I am going to be presenting our budget hearing tonight. I'll go over the budget that has been prepared for you all to adopt next week. Okay, our agenda for tonight, we're going to go over the general fund. We'll look at our fund balance, our beginning fund balance, revenues, expenditures. Then we'll look at all other funds and any notable changes in our other funds. Beginning fund balance. So this is, of course, a unique budget year with a pandemic going on. So the first thing we looked at in our budget subcommittee is we looked at the impacts of COVID-19 on the current fiscal year. That will affect our beginning balance going into the next budget year. We know that the final fund balance will be available after our audit about mid-September, and it is pending some pretty big variables. So the first being our July 15th state foundation payment, which will give us our best 28-week support unit count. That's a variable that it affects our budget. And then we have August property tax collections. That's the second payment for most taxpayers. And so that is a significant impact on our budget. And then any potential audit adjustments for items like invoices paid after the fiscal year ends if they need to be included in prior year or vice versa. So what we came down to, of course, this is a projection, was that our beginning fund balance for next fiscal year will be shown as increasing by $700,000. So this is the net of three main activities: programming deficits from School Plus and our nutrition services program. If you recall, because we did not furlough staff, and those programs are highly dependent on revenues that are based on, we weren't able to collect, for example, nutrition student fee collections, School Plus tuition. Those programs ran in a significant deficit. We also realized some savings from the closure, for example, special education contracted services, gas and school buses, utilities, etc. Carryover for purchases that were delayed to the closure. So this is what puts us in the black as far as finishing the fiscal year, but it's artificially inflating our fund balance because the carryover is related to commitments that we were not able to carry out before the fiscal year ended. For example, a curriculum purchase that we already are going to purchase, but we didn't make during the closure. So that is going to be included in fund balance. However, it's committed. So it's not so easy to see really how we ended the year operationally when you look at the fund balance number. Okay, going in, any questions on fund balance? Okay. General fund revenues. So here are two charts showing first our FY20 original budget for general fund revenue, and then our proposed FY21 general fund revenue. And you'll see that they are very similar. The one, you'll notice that it is a slice right at the top called out is CARES funding. So that will account for 2.1% of our general fund revenues. And then, quit sending emails, Steve. That will account for a small slice of our budget, but it does make an impact with the state's cuts. Okay, so just going over our state formula, it's always, in order to understand our budget, the state formula, knowing the basics about the state formula is incredibly important. So I'll remind you that 70% of our state revenues are based on two key variables: support units and staff mix. The staff we have on hand, as well as the students that we have showing up in our buildings. So a support unit is key to understanding the formula, and in essence, it's a distillation of our student attendance data. You could also call it a classroom unit. That makes it a little bit easier to understand when you think of it as a classroom of students. And two counts of support units matter most for our funding: the first 10 weeks of school, which we call the first reporting period, and our best 28 weeks of school, which is any of our best weeks for the whole school year, our best 28 weeks. And we are still waiting to get that number from the state. So that's why we don't know what our state revenues are until the year has ended. So here is a chart that helps you to understand how a support unit is made. It depends on the type of student, the grade level. And so, for example, 23 4th through 6th graders makes up one support unit. So if 23 4th graders show up every single day, that earns us one support unit. And then if you go to, for example, alternative secondary, 12 students would make up a support unit, and the state is recognizing that alternative students would need more resources. So that divisor is lower. Okay, so if you want to look at our support units as a district, you'll see that this is 9 years of prior year data along with projections for 2021. And you'll notice in the 2020 column, it's shaded in blue and italicized, the best 28 weeks. Like I said, we don't know that number yet. So we're going off of what our projection was for the 2020 budget year. You'll see that it's grown significantly over the years. And if we put it on a graph, you can see that trend line is increasing quite a bit. And first reporting period units are always higher than best 28 weeks units. You can see that the gap is pretty consistent in recent years. It got a little bit closer in prior years, and that just has to do with how well we keep students enrolled and how much they're showing up. If you apply a trend line to that data, you'll see that it's where we want it to go. It's increasing. However, we've used this trend line data in the past to come up with a projection for support units, but we have a big unknown going into the next school year. We don't know if perhaps some families will want to come into our district because it didn't work out with whatever situation they had during the pandemic, or if we're going to lose students because they just didn't work well with remote learning. So that is a huge unknown at this point. So if we were able to look into our crystal ball, we'd know how much to budget. But at this point, the budget subcommittee, we discussed that it probably would be best to just budget flat units, and that would give us the ability to reassess in the fall when we have enrollment numbers and we know how many kids are showing up.
Yeah, can I ask you a quick question?
Yep.
So the first reporting period, or for this year, what the state's going to give us or allocate to us, is the first reporting period from school year 2021, or is it from last year 19 to 20?
So the 2020 first reporting period units were 515.88 units. So we are budgeting current year actuals, not current year budget.
Okay. And then the best 28 weeks, that number that we use and the state will use for this year's funding will be last year's, right? So it'll be a snapshot from last year and not this year moving forward.
No, so we will, in July, we will know what we're being funded for the fiscal year that we're in, the one that's going to end at the end of the month. And then next year, it will be our best 28 weeks of attendance next year.
Right. I just wanted to make sure that, so the best 20 weeks is really based on last year's, this year's moving forward.
No, so the best 28 weeks is based on the current year. We just
Yeah.
don't have it until the end of the budget year. We actually,
Right.
Right,
kinda
but this
backwards,
current year moving forward for next year's budget, does that make sense? So it's not on the actual number of students that will attend this year, it was the number of students in the best 28 weeks last school year.
No,
No, it's
so I see what you're saying. You're wondering if we are basing it off of last year's actuals, because we have that number, right?
Right.
And we don't have any, we didn't base it off of last year's actuals. Last year's actuals were 505.4. And what we did was we took, because we had an increase in current year units going from 513 prior year for that first period to 515 this year, we felt that it was reasonable to assume that 507 would be about where we came
Right,
in.
I guess I'm trying to understand is the state, not what we're basing on, because I understand how you're doing your budget, because we have to project moving forward, but
Yeah.
what number is, and what time frame is the state using for our actual reimbursement? It will be last year's best 28 weeks.
No, it'll be,
No.
it'll
No,
be.
it's in
current.
real time. It's in, as we turn in attendance, real time.
That's
Yep.
why we have to wait until the July 15th of the next fiscal year to get it.
Right, so then I guess my question moves forward, has the state given you any idea, considering it's gonna be a different school year, how they're gonna handle if our attendance is all over the,
They have not. We're hoping that we will get some very clear information this summer, and that will help us to perhaps redo our budget.
right?
One of the things, Katie, one of the things I can tell you that they have made clear is they keep reiterating the 3% floor, the protective floor, that no district would be funded below that. In statute, there's written that no district who loses enrollment will fall below that 3%. So the most we would lose is 3% of last year's budget, which for us, I think is about 1.6, 1.7
Yes, that sounds right.
million dollars, and they're holding that line pretty steady right now because they do recognize it's a tough situation.
Right, yeah, that's the main reassurance we have going into next year. And in that situation, I'll talk about it a little bit later, we would qualify for a financial emergency, which would give the board a bit of authority to redo certain parts of our budget that otherwise we wouldn't be able to. So, any other questions?
Kate, did the
Yeah.
school closures at all affect what our best 28 weeks will look like, do you think, this year, or?
It is my understanding, I don't want to say until I see that report, we're very close to seeing that report, but it is my understanding that the state will not take into consideration the final weeks of school, which would cause potentially our best 28 weeks would be based off of fewer data points, so that could affect us. But they may, I don't know if they're just going to throw those weeks out or they're going to include them as 100% attendance. So it's, it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out. And I think hopefully, because the state sort of rebalanced this year with the 1% holdback, hopefully it won't be much different from what it was, in prior years. We wouldn't see a huge dip, because what else are, how are they going to reallocate that funding? So, all right, any other questions before I move on? Okay, so going back to the state formula, so the state will pay us based off of we talked about classroom units, now we're going to talk about staff mix, which drives our state revenue. The state will pay us for staffing based on where they land on the state's salary matrix. We have our own salary matrix, how we pay our employees. The state has the career ladder, and so they will place each of our employees on the career ladder. And then they'll add up every salary based on times FTE. You'll get a total salary number, and then that's divided by FTE, full-time, the number of employees. So it's not, if we hire somebody who places on the career ladder at 55,000, for example, the state's not going to send us 55,000. That changes the average on our formula. So it's not always a win-win situation for us. Sometimes never is. This is called the salary-based apportionment. And if you're someone who just likes to read things and see how it pans out, this slide will help you understand that better. But this is basically outlining what I said before, how the average is calculated. Okay, so going into our revenue changes for the new year budget, I put together some tables that show prior year budget, prior year. This one shows, I guess I shouldn't say prior year, but current year, the one ending, the fiscal year that's ending at the end of the month. Current year actuals, next year budget, and then the difference between current year budget and next year budget. So if you take a look at our actuals for current year, it's pretty close to what we budgeted. However, we get down to the 1% holdback, which that was taken into consideration with our fund balance change. If you compare the difference between next year's budget and current year budget, you see state revenues dipping by $270,000. So the state said that they would cut revenues by 5%. It didn't come out to 5% for going from last year to the next or current year. I'm going to get you all confused with that. So going from current year to next year, because they didn't cut current year 5%. They cut what the legislature adopted, which was already an increase. So they cut 5% from what their already adopted budget for next year was, which was an increase. So it doesn't, if you're going from FY20 to FY21, it doesn't equate to a 5% cut. Does that, everybody good there? Okay. So if we look at this, just to kind of bring units in here, that top number unit distribution is based on best 28 weeks units. The salary-based apportionment number is based on first reporting period units. So that's why the two counts matter the most to us. All right, to take a look at another comparison of revenues, we'll look at our other categorical funding for the state funding, and we also have that line item right there at the bottom, which is our CARES funding coming in. I don't want to go through each line item, but one thing to keep in mind is that the state did cut special programming line items in order to give districts flexibility when building their budget. For example, if they kept strings attached line items the same, that would require a school district to keep those expenditures the same. So by cutting the special payment line items, it gave districts ability to cut those programs as well if a district chose to do so. One example of our largest special payment cut was leadership premiums. And if you're not familiar with leadership premiums, that is something that pays for hard to fill stipends for special education positions, tech leaders, curriculum work, as well as building leadership teams. So those are just examples. Those are relied on quite a bit by our district leadership to promote that extra work. So that was a disappointment going into the budget process, but we expected cuts. So professional development was cut, as well as our lottery, our maintenance lottery funding for facilities. Then you have the CARES funding coming in at $1.7 million. Going against those cuts gives us an increase overall to our special payments of $172,000. This is another category. This is our local revenues coming into our budget. The biggest piece, of course, is our supplemental levy of $20 million. We did revise some line items here, one of them being the tort line item. That is levy revenue that we use as a line item to capture additional collections on our supplemental levy. And it felt a little optimistic to be budgeting so much more on that line item going into the unknown. So we cut that line item a bit. Transfers in, we increased in order to help balance our general fund. And then other local revenue was trued up to actuals. We were a little bit optimistic about that line item last year, so. All right, so if you look at our total foundation decrease with our change in special fund payments and then our change in local items, you have an overall decrease in revenues for our general fund of $278,000. All right, any questions about revenues? We're gonna jump into expenditures. So we're a service organization that would make our greatest expenditures salaries and benefits. And in order to build a budget that relates to our actual activities in the year, we need to get really close on payroll, salaries and benefits. So we use it, this method has been used, I think, for 3 or 4 years now, and it has proven very successful in budgeting close to what our actuals are. And basically what we do is we take our actual payroll for the year, and we in April will run reports for salaries and benefits. We'll project them through the end of the year. We'll subtract out any one-time payroll items. I don't believe we had any significant one-time payroll items. And then one thing I didn't add a bullet there is we'll add in stipends that haven't been paid throughout the year, so we'll project for those. This will help us calculate our flat budget. And we talked about this quite a bit in our budget subcommittee meeting. Flat does not always mean no cost fluctuation. For example, we want to be as close to actuals. We may have hired employees that cost less than outgoing employees from prior year, vice versa. You want to capture that fluctuation when you're redoing your budget. So here is a table of the overall expenditure changes based on cost type. So salaries, we see an increase of $418,000. The main factor there is the opening of the Nexus site. We have a greater square footage at that site compared to the old Hayden Lake School site. So we need more custodial work, secretarial support, administrative support, more teachers, of course, to staff those classrooms. We did maximize moving staff from other schools. Hopefully we're going to, if we're rezoning, moving students over to that school, we would need fewer teachers at other schools. We did need to put 2 teachers into the budget in order to make that school staffed fully. Benefits, you'll see that there's a reduction of $360,000. That does not mean we're cutting there. PERSI, our state retirement plan, has what they call PERSI sick leave, which were funded on that. So they gave all state organizations a rate holiday. So that is some savings, one-time savings to the budget. So that was a nice surprise when they announced that in January. Then you have some other cost fluctuations. You see that there are reductions. Those you'll see later that we have reduced programming on next slides. And then the last, transfers are moving funds from the general fund to our other funds. The main reduction there is buying fewer school buses, transferring less money to our bus fund.
Katie, on that line, how about the bottom there where it talks about contingency reserve and unappropriated balance?
Right.
That's tied to the carryovers from this year?
Yeah, so realistically, we would put the carryover in at the top like we are with beginning fund balance, and then we would budget out. But it felt more clear to just have it left over at the bottom. It won't be left over this year. We'll want to spend that carryover. It's committed, so it's going to be spent. But it felt like it was kind of muddying up the waters as far as seeing the real changes for the current fiscal year.
And so those were items that were in this year, current year's budget, that we've put purchase requests in or whatever it be on those items, but they aren't going to deliver by June 30th.
Right.
So we've committed those funds. They were in this budget cycle, but they're carrying over. Is that right?
Exactly. So the funds, the purchase orders are out there, the contracts are signed, but in order to, in accounting land, in order to apply it to current fiscal year, it has to be shipped, or, not shipped, but arrive on our premises by June 30th, which won't happen. So the expenditures will be posted to the next fiscal year.
And so that's mainly curricular materials, maybe our buses, our 2019, 2020 bus purchases?
I think we may get the buses, and that would be in the bus fund anyway, but curriculum's a huge one, technology. There was some travel that we're kind of up in the air on whether or not that's still going to happen, but it's not like the lion's share of that. As well as the schools were allowed to carry over their building budgets, because I got a lot of calls in the closure. Should I put in 100 purchase orders so I don't lose my money? And I said, no, please don't. We don't want to have stuff show up while no one's here. So a lot of budgets are available in that, or are included in that number, just because we wanted to postpone as much purchasing as possible. Okay, now these are additions to the budget. So kind of the bigger items here, the cost to meet the $40,000 minimum, that's the state minimum teacher salary. The state did not move any employees up on the career ladder, did not help us with our average salary or generate more revenue. However, they did meet the $40,000 minimum, which, it's always good to see that go up, and then our Nexus staffing needs, we've already discussed that. And then we did need to add 2 secondary teachers based on enrollment numbers right now. So proposed cuts, when we got down to adding up the reduction in revenues, the cost fluctuations, as well as the obligations we had to meet, we did need to look at cutting some programming. District professional development, it's likely that if there's a shutdown, we likely will not be traveling to conferences. So that was on the chopping block there. We'll have Medicaid help us out a little bit more than usual with our special education contracted services. We are going to buy 3 fewer buses. Normally we buy 6. We will buy 5 total, and the other 2 there are funded by state revenues that's built up from our depreciation for our buses. Technology was one of the areas identified by the state to be cut. So this is where we're going to delay some replacements. Can't really do that forever, but we'll do it this year. And then, of course, cutting our leadership stipends because the state cut those fully. School supply money will be cut by $100,000, as well as curriculum for $200,000. So here is a summary of everything we've discussed. You have 82.3, let me see, 82.4 million in revenues, 80.3 million in expenditures, which is leaving just over 2 million in addition to fund balance in the black. But of course, we have to account for that carryover that we didn't show as expenditures, just to kind of make it more clear. And then that leaves us 1.17 million available for additions. And then this is the settlement from, what is it, last week? Time's flying by. A half step for all staff of experience on our salary matrix. Maintain insurance because we had our insurance rate increase, which leaves us our budget in a deficit of just under 50,000. So of course we set this budget with our best work, but there are a number of items that can cause us to deviate from the budget. I'll just go over a few. The main factors: support unit increase every year, that's a possibility. I would be very surprised if it happens this year, but we can always hope. Support units can fall short of projected numbers. A deficit would be expected in this situation. And we would possibly qualify for the financial emergency per Idaho code, and we would have a lot of leeway in order to redo our budget with cuts. Of course, we talked about the 3% floor, so we have to eat the first 3% of state revenue reductions, and then after that we would be held harmless. Changes in number of unfilled positions. So if the economy is worse, we have a fuller staff, that causes our expenditures to be higher than expected. Additional stimulus funding, that would certainly help things if we have additional costs due to COVID or any other funding cuts. And then additional state holdback. So rather than, everything, all the protections that are put into the formula, the state can also say, we're going to hold back 2%, just like they did with the 1%.
And I would just like to add that they could also say, we're going to go ahead and give you the money that we held back if that money would show up, if we were being optimistic. Potentially, the 5% could all come back into play. We keep our I'm not making any promises by any means, but it isn't a cut, it's a holdback. And so if revenues were to change, that's a possibility.
Any questions? We're going to move on to all other funds. Okay, so we've got a number of funds outside the general fund. We don't spend as much time on them as we do our general fund because most of the funds are strings attached. A lot of federal regulations, for example, our IDEA special education funds, our Title I funds, and we also have our bond projects funds. So this is a chart comparing FY21 revenues to FY20 revenues. And kind of some notable changes. Our miscellaneous local grants, that one looks a little odd this year. We have a number of things going through there. The main activity in that fund is when our ASB accounts use the district credit card, we run those transactions through this fund. And that one was, I believe, it was over budgeted last year, but in the end, it doesn't really impact the district financially because it's an in and out. So the school will use the credit card and then they will reimburse us from their ASB funds. And then E-rate, we show a little bit of a reduction in revenue, just trying to be realistic there. Classroom technology, the state cuts. Medicaid might throw you off. The state had us move to a different fund just for reporting purposes. So you see it up there, and then we moved it down to the federal area. Special education federal funding got a little bump this year, which is really good news. On the other hand, our Title I funding and Title II was reduced a little bit. And then you see that, let's see, bond debt service, that is the levy for the bond. We always set that at a placeholder in order to levy what keeps our levy rate the same. That's always the goal, or to be able to drop it. Of course, that's the goal, but we have to build capacity there because we cannot levy more than what we've budgeted. So it's always better to shoot high, and then you always budget less, which is the goal, or you always levy less.
I did a question about some of the partnerships we have with local municipalities, primarily Hayden and the city of Coeur d'Alene for SROs. Have we had commitment from them moving forward for those programs for this year? And I know Kootenai Health was maybe changing some of their partnerships. Is that accounted for in our budget, or?
So we communicated with the police department, and there has been no discussion of cutting the SRO program, which is, it felt like they were in the police department pretty confident that that was not going to change. But the city, their fiscal year ends September 30th, so they're just beginning their budget work. I would feel very uncomfortable being a budget person to make a commitment, a few months before I've really gotten into budget work to make a commitment. So that came from the police department, not from the city budgeting department, but they felt pretty positive about it. Kootenai Health, unfortunately, they were funding our head nurse. Of course, we can't do without our head nurse, especially in a pandemic. So we're going to have to, that was not included in the budget. That was a little too late to capture that with our budget summary being due. So hopefully we'll be able to maybe identify some other cost savings to make that whole, but we definitely can't do without her. And then we also, there was some athletic training, and I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Steve.
Yeah, it's a partnership between Kootenai Health to provide the medical guidance for the athletic training program. And it's valued by both Kootenai Health and by us, but there was some need to rediscuss that and renegotiate. And I think we aren't finished yet, but I anticipate that we'll come up with an agreement that we can work through. Cost was not tremendous, but it was still something that both sides felt like we needed to talk through. But I believe that we'll find a pretty easy solution to that one.
All right, any other questions on all other funds revenues? This slide is just the numbers if you prefer to look at the figures rather than the chart. And then we've got our expenditures for all other funds. The fluctuations follow mostly the same as the revenue fluctuations. However, the one line item that kind of grabs the eye is the bond projects. And so, of course, as we're wrapping up our bond projects, the expenditures will decrease. And we hope to be paying out that retainage on Nexa pretty soon here. Any questions on expenditures? Same thing here, just the figures.
Can I ask one question on the class size expenditure? Is it something that just expired and so it doesn't have to be refunded, or?
That, I thought I updated it here on this slide. That is actually Medicaid. We just recycled an old fund, so the old description was in there. Okay, any other questions overall? Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ebner, for the presentation. Let's see here. We can go ahead and open up the public comment period. And Ms. Town, you're grabbing our sheet for us. Sir, did you want an opportunity to sign up for public comment?
I would like to say a few words.
Okay, so we'll have you just sign up real quick, then I'll get that sheet, and we'll have you guys, we'll go. Okay, gentlemen, I'll just go in order here. Mr. Tyler, Jeff Tyler, I'll have you go first. If you just step up to the podium and on the mic there, just make sure the little red light's on, just above the red button there, if you would, please, sir. And welcome. Thanks for being here.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and Board. My name is Jeff Tyler. I live at 5892 West Harbor Drive, Coeur d'Alene. I was even once, before I retired a couple years ago, did a stint driving the school bus for the district, so I'm familiar with the schools and things here, and which I support. I'm also the chairman of Northwest Property Owners Alliance, which we watch for taxing for different things for the people here in the county. We also have an attorney hired that is protecting the waters here so that we have control of the water instead of the tribe. Our group also stopped the sale of a Vista to a Canadian company. We were instrumental in that too. So the reason I'm here is I spent a couple of days last week at the county during their budget hearings, and some interesting information came up. The president passed down $1.5 billion to the state of Idaho for relief to the state for things that were associated with COVID-19. He also wanted that relief to go to property taxpayers, some of it. So it left, so the governor decided to put $188 million of it to taxing districts throughout the state. The catch is the taxing district cannot raise any property taxes. They have to stay with a zero increase plus new growth. So new growth doesn't factor in. The other part of the formula is that what they would do is they would reimburse any salaries and benefits associated with COVID-19 in those taxing districts. So being that this school district is really mostly labor-based, and I think from what I understood from the county is they're going to be pretty relaxed on what factors in as being COVID-19 based. I would say pretty much all the teachers would be, because they had to rearrange things for the COVID-19. Maybe just mowing the yards might be the only thing that wouldn't matter, you know. That would be up to, I guess, the superintendent or one of you to investigate that. But yeah, I didn't hear anything about this tonight on this budget. But being that the board is elected by the people, besides representing parents, you also represent the property taxpayers and you represent your voters. And the property taxpayers would, I know, enjoy having the break on their property taxpayers, on the property taxes. In the county, they estimated that about $49 million is what they collect in taxes, and that about $24 million is what they could conceivably get from the state of Idaho, and they get 103%. So you get 3% to pay for extra administrative costs. So basically, you apply to the state the amount of money that is labor and benefits. And whatever that amount ends up being that you work out with the state, that would come off of what you bill to the property taxpayers in the county, but you'll still receive the money from the state. This is all part of that COVID-19 money. So, I'm just here to implore to you guys to do some diligence and see if you can make this work. There was mention that the $188 million may not be enough for the whole state, for every taxing district to use this. But the situation is there's some taxing districts that they don't want to go through the trouble of trying to do it, or they want to get the tax increase. But there's a lot of people that are suffering right now. There's, being a bus driver, I've got friends that are driving buses right now still, and a lot of them had it pretty good without saying a whole lot this year, because it was good that you kept them paid so they'll be there when you need them. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people that were unemployed and are suffering, especially small business owners. And everybody in the county and the state, that's a state or county employee that I've seen, city, have all gotten their full benefits and their full pay. So a lot of you don't feel it like some folks in our community and some of the property taxpayers in our community. And the property taxpayers would certainly like to see you make the effort to try to get this, I guess you could even call it a windfall, back to them for a one-time to get that break on their taxes, just to help them out. But like I said, it shouldn't affect your budget, other than you can't increase it increase your budget and do a tax. You can't do a tax of 1%, 2%, or 3%. But like I said, they said new growth would be okay. And I think the legislature is even going to talk about maybe even possibly going to a 1% cap and still collect the money. So I'm just here to hopefully have you guys will investigate that and help the property taxpayers out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. I think we certainly support the idea, and we're mindful of our taxpayers. Certainly, we're all taxpayers. I believe, and maybe Ms. Ebner, you could respond, but we're a different taxing district than basically any other taxing district, because we don't get to take automatic up to 3% increases. Any local tax that we raise is approved by the voter. We cannot raise taxes without voter approval. So my understanding is that funding that the governor's made available is not available to school districts, but I could be wrong on that.
Right. I've been working pretty closely with with the school districts in Idaho, and there's been a lot of research put into whether or not FEMA funding is available to us, because FEMA authorized counties to have access to FEMA or the resources for COVID-19. And what we're finding is that because we're receiving CARES money, that would be considered double dipping as far as receiving revenues for the impacts of COVID. I will, follow up on your concern just to make sure that we're just going after as much funding as we can in order to provide relief to our local taxpayers. Even though that the FEMA funding was sort of proving to be a dead end, I am going to have a conference call tomorrow with someone from our county as well, just to keep following that lead. So.
Thank you. Okay, and next up, Tom Lucas. Good evening, sir. Same with you. If you'll just approach the mic there and make sure it's on for me.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Lucas, and I live at 605 East Locust, so I'm just down the street. I probably could have walked, but it was easier driving because I was late. I am a current taxpayer in Kootenai County. I've lived here for 41 years and have putting quite a bit of money into the fund. Strongly support School District 271. We've had 3 children and grandchildren growing up in this area. And I commend all of you for the time you put in. I've done budgets before in a past life, and it's not easy. But one of the things I'd like to have you consider is that Kootenai County is an aging community. There are more and more people, and with white hair, some of us with no hair, that have come here to retire. I wasn't picking on you, Jeff, I'm sorry. When my wife and I bought our first home here in Coeur d'Alene, we had to go through the process of going to a bank and qualifying for that home based on our income and our savings at that time. We've had 3 homes over the 41 years that we've lived here, and each time we've gone through that process. As I retired, and I was able to retire quite a number of years ago, the income that I was making all of a sudden shuts off, and it's Social Security. The savings that we had 10 or 12 years ago, we've been nibbling away at that. That was our retirement income. We're managing, we're looking at the expenses. We're not going out on any cruises, long vacations. But I have many, many, many friends, seniors in this community, that are just really struggling to get by. I was the executive director for Elder Help for 3 years. We have a senior help program through our church. And my heart just goes out for so many of the seniors in this community. When they buy a home, they're qualified for X number of dollars. My home is an example on Locust Street. I've got 7 houses that have sold in the last year and a half within 100 yards of my house. And my values weren't, my taxes weren't based on what I could afford and what I qualified for, but they're based on those 7 houses that sold nearby. And the values on some of those places, I'm shaking my head seeing, I would probably not qualify today to move into the house that my next door neighbor moved into a year and a half or 2 years ago. There are any number of seniors that are having to make the hard decision of, gee, I think I'm going to have to sell my house. And granted, the prices have gone up, but any equity they take out of that sale, they're not going to be able to afford to go anywhere else. I've become a very strong advocate for seniors, trying to start a new 501c3 for a senior home share program that seniors that are now living alone in their own homes have an extra room that they can rent out just to make ends meet. We're trying to match up some other senior that can't quite afford the rents that keep going up in this community and move in and pay an affordable rent for a senior that's trying to decide, do I keep my home? I think there's another number of changes kind of shifting gears. I used to do this on a regular basis, but I decided about 15 years ago it was time for somebody else to get up to the mic. But there are changes that our school district can make for the better. And I think you all realize that. We need to pay our teachers, especially the ones that excel, we need to pay them more money. Those that do not excel or just get by, we need to have a mechanism to send them down the road. And right now, again, this is a soapbox that I get on with my wife, and she says, well, why don't you go talk to them? Well, we need to get to a point where the school district has to look at the unions for the schools, the police departments have to look for law enforcement unions. We have to get to a point where we're saying, hey, unions were very important at one time in our community. Right now, they're just putting us at deadlock. We can't do anything without litigating. How do we get rid of the bad people? They just keep floating to the top. That's a soapbox. I'll kind of step down now. Thanks for your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lucas. Okay, that is all we had signed up for tonight. So that's going to end our budget hearing tonight, and we'll talk budget and be back again with budget next week during budget adoption next Monday. Okay. So we'll move on our agenda here. And we had a consent agenda item. And is there a motion to approve consent agenda item A? All right, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. And next up's the action item to ratify a negotiated agreement. And Dr. Cook, is anyone given a highlight on that? Okay.
I don't think so. I think that we were just going to let you and Trustee Smith maybe talk that through.
Okay. So, Ms. Smith, do you want to do that, or you want me to do that? Okay. There was a summary in the board packet today, And also, the entire master articles are in the board packet today for your review. Let the motorcycle go by there. Okay. So we started our bargaining process a month or so ago, maybe not quite that long ago, a few months ago, and a few weeks ago, Ms. Smith and I were on that team. And, really the association and their folks worked well with us. They understand the predicament that the state's in, that we're in, that our community members are in. And, we were able to work pretty quickly to go through Ms. Ebner's budget numbers and come to agreement on a number of kind of non-monetary issues and monetary issues. And as you'll see in there, we did have a significant health care increase to our health insurance premiums, about 8.7%. The agreement we made with the association is that the district would pick up that cost. That was, Ms. Ebner, what was the monetary value on that? You remember? Yeah. $800,000. Okay, thank you, Dr. Cook. But other than the folks where the state moved the minimum mandatory salary from $38,500 up to $40,000, those are the only folks that got a salary increase, or that was the only cell. And then if you're familiar with our salary matrix, it's grid, and so you move down, which we call steps for each year of experience, I believe up to 15 years, somewhere in that ballpark, or you can move across based on education. And this year we withheld any education movements, so folks who've taken education credits are not going to move to the right on the grid, unfortunately, this year. And ultimately we agreed at a half step, so instead of moving from, let's say, year 10 to year 11 on the grid, they're moving to 10 and a half, if you will. Now at some point that's got to get trued back up in the future, where we'd either hold again to get it back to a whole number, or maybe you move 1.5, or I don't know how it works, but that's how it's worked in the past. So when it came to pay, those were the agreements. So not quite the same as last year, where we were able to give a pretty significant raise to our folks. So is there any questions about that? Okay, go ahead, Ms. Pickford.
I'll make the motion to ratify the 2020-2021 negotiated agreement as presented.
Okay. All right, thank you. It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. We will move on.
Chair Morrisroe,
Yes.
I'd just like to comment. I think that it's a testament to the commitment of the board and the union's team, if you will, to continue to work in a very collaborative and meaningful fashion together. And I want to thank Dr. Trina Cottle for her hard work in CAPS this year. I think she's done a really nice job to help facilitate that relationship, and we're going to continue with that commitment in the future with both IBB and the CAPS process. It does foster a much better communication standard between the groups, and we're glad to continue that process. But I just want to give her some credit for that and thank her for her commitment as she moves on to another district, and we'll take that elsewhere. But we will continue doing that work. It's good for both the board and for the union to participate in that.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Cook. We're going to move on to our information item that we have for tonight, which is a couple of policies surrounding magnet schools. And maybe before we jump into those, I just maybe want to make sure we're all on the same page, and maybe those who are interested know kind of where we're at with this. It's been a little different practice with these policies, just because we know there's a lot of public interest around those. So we've had a number of workshops around magnet school policies and magnet school enrollment zones, those sorts of things, over the past 6 or 8 months, and this is just a continuation of that. And we met via Zoom in April? Can't remember when that was, and looked at some draft policies around magnet schools, and I think provided quite a bit of feedback for administration and for legal counsel to go back with those proposed policies and make some adjustments, some amendments, bring it back to us again. And so tonight is just that we're seeing these policies back again. If you've, well, I know you've had an opportunity to review them, but there's some options in there that I'm pretty certain they want to get our feedback, how we feel about different potential paths. And then we'll continue this on. So we're going to provide some feedback tonight. I assume the feedback, there'll be another round of edits. And once we get to where we're all fairly comfortable with the document, I think administration's comfortable with the document, we'll move it kind of into our typical policy framework where it'll come to a board meeting, it'll be presented to us, it'll be open for public comment at that board meeting, and then we'll leave that open for a month or whatever we decide at that board meeting, and then bring it back for action. So that's the process. So tonight we're just looking for feedback on those edits. What I was thinking, just as we're planning ahead on these policies, and I don't know how far we'll get tonight, but I know it's really hard to get parents to pay attention in summer, and we kicked off today, right, with summer. So I was thinking we'd wait till the school year begins before we bring these back for information at a board meeting if we're ready for that. So that was just my thoughts, and I'm certainly open to other ideas, but that was what I was planning, maybe September at the earliest, that we'd see them for info, for like an October action. And maybe that's too early just because of the way, we're getting going in the school year and it's a busy time also. These, whatever changes or edits we're making here wouldn't go in effect until next school year. And I think, Dr. Cook, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of these policies is a brand new policy that we don't have on the books currently. Is that right? And one's a redo, or
They're
are
actually
they both redos?
They're actually both brand new, at least in placing it into the board's hand through the governance model. But if you recall, we've been talking about this now for several times. The first one, the policy 9810, is a policy that governs why a magnet school would exist. And I think we're getting awfully close on that one. It's talking through what might constitute the reasons for why a school would either come into existence or want to declare their role as what we believe is the reason for a magnet school. And there might be some tweaking that we may still need to get into, and I think continued conversation on the other policy would be the one that gives us that clarity. And so this policy didn't exist. We had two magnet schools that had quite perfunctorily found their purpose in the district, and that's the first one. The second one is really about how does a magnet school declare who gets enrolled into their system, and that's the one that we're getting a tremendous amount of discussion and feedback. And I think we've brought to you a couple of times, I think, with some suggestions, and used that feedback to incorporate those changes. And so we have currently on a Zoom call right now, and on this meeting, we have both of the magnet school principals ready to give input and feedback and to take questions. And we also have our legal team who have been helping us rewrite these policies as we start the practice. And one of the things I would want to share that has come along as a late addition, we got several comments today that maybe like emails or questions from public that tend to make us wonder if maybe there's some misinformation out there. So we took the opportunity today to have the legal team write kind of the history of what got us to this point and add that. And so that's going to be, we're going to have that on screen. And I think Megan O'Dowd, one of our attorneys, might be available to kind of talk us through some of those reasons and rationale, so that we recognize the the intention here, and I think clarifies what Chair Morserow was just drawing to the attention of this group, that we're not in some state of readiness at this point to adopt anything. We're just now working through and getting to fine tuning these policies for something to adopt this fall. Both magnet schools will have students enrolled in them this September and will not be affected by this policy is for the following year's work. So we've got quite a bit of time to work out the detail and to reassure our parents that nobody's going to be kicked out of the magnet schools at this point. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Megan so that she has an opportunity to walk us through this document.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Morserow and members of the board. I can't see your screen, so I don't know if the executive summary is up. Can you guys see that? Can anybody tell me if that's up?
It's not, but
On
Seth,
ours.
can you put the document up? Thank you. Okay, it is up.
Steve, do you want me to do a share screen, or is that something that?
No, you can just go ahead. It's on screen
mute.
now. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Megan. You can just go ahead and start talking.
Steve, oh, there we go. Can you guys say that one more time? Because you guys were all on mute. So are you looking at the executive summary now? Okay, perfect. Okay, so we put, like Dr. Cook said, we put this together after hearing some of the feedbacks to give a little bit of context, at least from what we heard the board ask for in the last meeting. And those are the bulleted, what I heard, at least what we heard as the primary goals of the board in the last draft. So some of the big ones were minimizing the oversight role of the board after the magnet school policies, or after a magnet school has shown itself to be self-sufficient. We had originally modeled that off of the charter schools, and the board really expressed wanting to have a much lighter touch. So I think we've accomplished that goal. We heard loud and clear that the board wants the siblings and families that have already been in attendance to be able to re-enroll simply by submitting the confirmation of enrollment and not having to go through any sort of lottery process, regardless of whether they've moved out of a zone or maybe have lost their initial priority zone. So once you're in, and we've made that clear as well. The third major goal we heard was to try to figure out a way to minimize the impacts on the neighboring schools that are being pulled away from by these magnet schools. And this just becomes a bit of a balancing act, these last several. So considering SES and equity issues and balancing enrollment and capacity needs, which may not be the same as the original impacts on neighboring schools. And then the last one is just trying to simplify the process as a whole. So with those kind of overarching goals in mind, we went through and did a substantial rewrite of both proposed policies and procedures. And this is our summary of what these are. So the policy 9810 is, as Dr. Cook already mentioned, this gives the first introduction of what a magnet school is, how it is distinguished from a focused school. There's a few features of how those are different. One, there is no attendance zone associated with a magnet school. It will have a special area of focus that's integrated in your program activities. And you may get some deviation from other board policies. So some examples of that from our existing magnet schools are deviations from bell schedules, teacher prep time, etc. We've identified that framework for new magnet schools should some other schools come on the board and want to get that status. And then again, we've really softened the initial, once the 3 to 5 year kind of oversight by the board has been accomplished, the board takes a step back with the idea that they will just, the schools will really just come in every year to maybe give some success stories is what we heard. And then the last major concept with 9810 is the introduction of the magnet priority zone. We wanted to make very clear that this is a board function and decision. So whether or not a magnet school exists and where that boundary zone is all a decision of the board. The board could change that decision or location at any time, but generally we've drafted it so that it would be formally revisited every 3 years. So that's 9810 in a nutshell, how magnet schools are made and how they stay as magnet schools. Then we switched to 3012, which is the enrollment process. And as Dr. Cook mentioned, this is really the meat of what we've been looking at over these last several months. So we have tried to give the board some flexibility, again, with options. There are 2 procedures that the board has to consider tonight. Model 1 is priority zones exist. Model 2 are priority zones do not exist. Within each of those models, there are 2 options, with each option integrating an SES economic equality type option. We gave those options so that the board could review it, hopefully pick the one that they liked, and with the idea that only one of those options would ever be approved with finality. And the other important thing about 3012 from a policy standpoint is that the board establishes some priority standards that have to be in place no matter what procedures get adopted. And those are, again, that staff, children of staff members at any magnet school get top priority. Siblings of already enrolled students get priority. And then if a priority zone does exist, that would be the kind of the third main priority zone. So those are the overarching introductions of the policies, and Annie is going to help kind of walk the board through the procedure model. So I'm gonna pass it over to Annie here.
Okay. Hi everyone. I just wanted to, continue on what Megan's explaining. We've presented the board last time with a few different options for procedures, and after all of the feedback and sort of the overarching goals that Megan talked about that we heard last time, we've got 2 new models to try and work through. Both of the models, I think what we've definitely seemed to have come up with is that we want to prioritize students of staff members at the magnet schools and siblings of current students, and keep students in once you're in for your whole elementary time. So I think we're there, and then we've shifted these around a little bit from the last ones. So the first model 1, that one would still have what we have now, which is the magnet priority zones, change the name from overlay zones. But we also have sort of some additional priorities that we would place in there to try to balance the enrollment impacts on neighboring schools. So we would either give priority to students from schools that have been designated as being over capacity and needing to, shift some over to that school, or on the opposite end, schools that are significantly impacted by magnet schools pulling students out of them would maybe have caps on enrollment. So model 1 has one option, or it has 2 options. First option takes all of those factors into account, and those might change from year to year. The second option has the same priority groups, but also adds socioeconomic balancing into the mix by prioritizing students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. That just seems to be the simplest way to kind of address socioeconomic balance. So the second model does the exact same thing with the capacity limits, but it takes the magnet priority zone completely out of the equation, and that more envisions a sort of pure lottery system where we take a certain number of kids from each school. If certain schools are more impacted negatively by magnet school enrollment, there'd be caps on how many students can come from those schools. If there's students or schools that are well over capacity, those ones might be given priority. So I think, and again, I think Megan mentioned this, but in case she didn't, both of those options are drafted within each model. We would envision you only actually using one of them. It's just all in there, and it can look a little intense when it's all in there, but one of them wouldn't stay. Also, the application would still be the same no matter what. It would just be a simple 1 or 2 page document that would just address the minimum information that we would need in order to determine where a student would be placed in the lottery. And we would finalize that once we decided on an actual procedure. So I think that should cover it.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if Seth has unmuted us or not.
You're good.
So why don't we just handle questions maybe about the policies separate, or if there's clarification needed. So the first policy, the 9810, about creating or maintaining magnet schools. You know, to me, it feels like they did a pretty nice job of capturing the commentary and the discussion that we had a month and a half ago or whenever that was. But anyone have any questions or concerns within that? Okay, I'm not hearing much. Okay.
I guess
I sort of
really
anticipate
quickly,
that, but go ahead.
sorry, yeah, just one question. It's the section about the superintendent acts as a gatekeeper, that point. I'm assuming, because of the relationship we have, that the superintendent would present to the board, hey, there is an option coming down the pike and some folks are interested in that, and that information wouldn't be held back, but it would be presented when it was ready. Is that kind of the intent behind that?
I think, are you talking about the part about the superintendent gives the board the information about the numbers of cap students that could potentially be, are you talking
No,
about the
not
cap?
the caps. This is still in the first.
This is on page two, 1, 2, 3, fourth. I'd call it the fourth paragraph.
Yeah.
Board directs superintendent
Yeah. You want to ask?
or designee to develop an application process consistent with these broad concepts. Superintendent will act as the initial gatekeeper for applications. This is on school applications.
Dr. Cook, if I can interject here, I think the intent here was, as Trustee Smith indicated, I think the idea that we had was just that superintendent or designee, somebody will say, okay, we've got a complete application here. You've met items 1 through 5. Now we're ready to present to the board, just so that the board isn't entertaining incomplete applications.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Smith. Any other questions or comments on 9810? Okay, so why don't we move on to 3012? As Megan and Dr. Cook said, there's kind of 2 variations there, and maybe before we discuss those, there's 2 variations with 2 variations. But before we discuss those, it may help in my comments, I guess, is how do you envision those? Do you, as far as with zones or without zones, do you envision that we're picking one of those, or that we have both of those, their options, and kind of the magnet school selects we want to be this way or that way?
Well, I think we've talked about that, and I'm also, remember, we've got the principals on, and I don't know that our principals necessarily even agree on what serves their purpose the best. And so I think that's part of what we wanted to kind of ferret out tonight in this conversation was, first of all, is it reasonable to have an attendance zone for like a magnet school? I think that's the very first question. That is, it comes with perks and benefits and limitations and all kinds of things. And I think that's the first thing that we kind of discussed as a group and as the administrators, if you will, from myself to the principals and all the people that are in between that are delivering upon that. Is it, when it comes to a programmatic school, you think about it, we've got a pure neighborhood school like Bryan Elementary, and you've got a focus school like Nexa, which actually has a focus but functions like a neighborhood school. And then you've got a magnet school that in either Ramsey or Sorensen, in which students are prioritized in an area that might be interested in the programming, and those students get prioritized ahead of any other students outside of that area, and whether or not that should be a qualifier. And that's not necessarily a decision that we administratively are going to lean in on, unless you guys want our input and our feedback. But that was, I think that's one of the first things that we want to decide. And then secondly, what is it that are those priorities, if you look at the ones we've talked about it, that Megan presented as a part of how we've gotten to this point, some of those start to become choices, because if you're going to do one, you can't do the other. And so part of the feedback we were seeking tonight is that a discussion that we want to have if we were to choose, for example, to put a zone into play for both or one of the magnet schools? Then how do we administer those access from the zone into the school or access outside of the zone into the school? Because part of what our discussion was how do we diversify our magnet schools, and how do you diversify? How do you do something at one that you can also have exist at the others? And some of that work comes out of the boundary work, if you will, that some of the impacts of magnet schools that are having on schools both nearby and across the district. And so that's kind of the nature of the discussion we'd like to get to. And it would make it a whole lot easier on us to start to pick one direction or the other to go in bringing you back quality input into these policies, so that we can get that, I think, that discussion move forward, because we do feel a little bit like we might be spinning our wheels until we make some major decisions like that.
Dr. Cook, you mentioned attendance zone, did you mean? Mine's on, yeah. Did you mean priority zone or attendance zone? When you first started the conversation, you want guidance from us whether we want to use an attendance zone, and I'm guessing you meant priority zone, like an overlay, or do you mean a traditional attendance zone for these schools? Because that's not in
Right. Well, I meant specifically priority zone, but
Okay.
I think that's the thing that we're talking about. I think even when we were talking about the boundaries, if you recall, we hung up when we got into the boundary discussion about redoing all the elementary schools, about whether or not magnet schools should have formalized attendance zones and what that would create. And so now you could have a full attendance zone that is these are the hard lines that create a neighborhood school, or you could have a priority zone, which gives preference to folks that live in a particular area, or you could have neither and just have a true magnet model. And I think that's the part that I'm trying to focus on, is now let's talk about that priority zone and whether or not that is accomplishing what it is that the goal desires to be the outcome.
So not adding an attendance zone, just so I'm clear.
Unless you guys want to, we're not
I
indicating.
was equally confused by your comments, because like Lisa is, I thought you were saying you wanted us to decide today whether we were doing attendance zones
Priority
or
zones.
priority zones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Priority
'Cause
zones.
we're all
But I will
past-
say whoever came up with the priority zone, because that language changed from last time. I think it was something, remember, it was something totally different. Yeah, it was like PPZ or something. So whoever came up with
I like
magnet
the new
priority
term.
zone, that makes sense, so.
So why don't we have that conversation real quick around those kind of two big building blocks, I guess, is do we envision what I would say almost kind of status quo and continuing with the way we are functioning with some sort of preferred zone? Or are we looking to do something new? And whoever wants to start on that with where there wouldn't be a zone.
Which would be just strictly lottery. Well, we've been hearing loud and clear that, I don't think I've read one that went email that said strictly lottery. Unless I missed an email, but I don't think we received one, so. I kind of like the priority zone myself. I feel like people buy houses downtown and, or near schools, and for some reason it's, they can walk to school, it's easy for them. I just kind of like that feel myself, so.
And I would agree. I think on our survey from the boundary review work, we saw that neighborhood schools were a very high priority for our community. And I think if we veer off the feedback that we've received from the community, we would need lots of time and education as to why we would do that. I know nationally it seems like the norm trends more towards not having an attendance zone or a priority zone, but many of those schools that are discussed are real urban centers that have lots of public transportation and a different paradigm than maybe we're currently seeing. So it seems like a priority zone offers the best compromise with having magnet schools and still honoring the community's desire for neighborhood schools.
I agree.
Yeah, same. I would lean that way. We've definitely heard that, unless there's something different from our principals that we're missing. That would be my only concern there. But for myself, yeah, staying with the priority zones.
All right, so we have,
Wait, I didn't get to speak
Oh,
yet.
oh, sorry.
Jeez, easy, Miss Dr. Cook. Okay. Jeez. So I would agree. I think in the model we're currently in, I guess. Although to me it's very intriguing. Like I think long picture, and if another magnet school came along, would you want that to even be an option? And to me, I could see running both. But let's say you had a more centralized school that wants to do, whatever, have some sort of function, and we may want to draw, more equally from around the district. I mean, or a high school, yeah, right, a high school or a middle school or whatever it is. So, and maybe it's just too tough and too confusing for our current parents and consumers and community to try to run those parallel and do them both at the same time. But I think long-term I'd be interested in at least talking about that, maybe having that as an option. That would be like if another school came along and they proposed to be a magnet school, that we kind of say, what model do you envision? And then we figure out how that works in our district. And because I think there's room for both. I agree. Whether it's around Ramsey or Sorensen, there is a attendance zone there if you asked half those families. And I think it would be very challenging to change that. And it's part of what makes those schools unique is there's local buy-in and there's, people that are there because of the program too. So it's a mixture of the two. So.
Can we maybe hear from the principals? If we have them on or no? Oh, sorry, Steve.
so before I grab them, and I think I love the idea of that conversation, because it's anchored in the community, right? People know and understand that there's a zone around Sorensen, that there's a zone around Ramsey. However, if you opened a new school and said, let's say you were going to open a new magnet high school, and you were going to open it in the Maverick across from Lake City High School, what would Lake City High School think about that if they said we're going to prioritize folks in that zone? So I think there's a very real conversation to happen at some point about that. But pulling the rug out from under someone, I think we've had that conversation with our principals, and it's a very interesting and fascinating conversation because it does have a standard, a set, something we've been doing for many years, and it's a common expectation, but it may have a need to evolve over time. So I'm going to ask Crystal and we've also got Jeff on too. So if you need questions with the operational side, I'm going to ask Crystal and Brett and Aaron, who are all on Zoom right now, to lean in on this conversation, talking about what it would look like if we were to continue a priority zone, and whether that creates the kind of conditions that they would desire, or if it creates challenges, or both, and just have them lean in on that. So hopefully there's not too bad of a delay. And then I'll stop talking so Seth can mute us and get it switched over to the Zoom call. And Megan and Annie are still on, so we can ask them questions as well.
Good evening, everybody. Brett Depew here. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, thanks, Dr. Cook, and good evening, Chairman Casey Morris-Rowe and fellow trustees. If it's okay, I'd like to take just a few minutes and kind of share with you some reflection about all of this regarding priority zone or no priority zone, and some discussions that I've had with members of our staff, and I feel compelled to share this with you, not to sway your decision making in any of this, but here I'll turn my camera on. There I am. Hello. Not necessarily to sway any of your decisions. You have some hard decisions coming your way regarding all of this, but just to kind of offer some of the background on this journey we've all been over the course of the school year together regarding our work in rezoning our school district, as well as what came out of that in terms or in relation to the magnet schools. So if you're okay and willing to bear with me, I have hopefully some really good and important and valuable points to share with you. Is that okay? Everybody good with that? I can't see you, so I'm assuming I'm okay because nobody's told me to shut up yet. I'm going to read this only because I want to make sure that I don't take you down any rabbit holes. So again, bear with me. All of us who have sat through the zoning committee meetings and numerous open public forums that have taken place over the course of the school year know the issues regarding both of our magnet schools. We have read through the pages and pages of public feedback, and as it pertains to Sorensen, we've heard loud and clear the concerns for what many consider to be perceived issues of inequity regarding our lottery enrollment process and the potential negative impact it has on our neighboring elementary schools, in addition to the potential limited accessibility of families who may not have that appropriate resources in applying or transporting or being accepted into the school through the current lottery process as it pertains to the order of priorities. We've spent countless hours sifting through those so far 5 magnet proposals that were created based on feedback we've heard from our community as well as our school board. And throughout all of this, my position has really been to try my best to be a good listener and be open-minded. I've heard from parents of students at various elementary schools, ours included, feedback ranging from many who feel passionate that the current policy is fair and appropriate, all the way over to those who strongly feel there's an imbalance of equity due to our low free and reduced lunch and our population at Sorensen in comparison to the other elementary schools. And I now find myself asking this question, and that is there a better way that allows for the leveling of the playing field and gets Sorensen SES numbers somewhere closer to our district average without diluting the years of hard work and dedication put forward by the Sorensen community of past and present, the 2 recent policy proposals that we've already kind of begun to talk about tonight, Model 1, including a priority zone, or Model 2, not with having no priority zone, are based on community and school board feedback. I strongly, in our discussions, model number 1, having a priority zone, as some of you had noted tonight, thinks that this could be maybe the more logical path that allows Sorensen to continue to move forward with the unique magnet programming while also widening our window for more diverse students from varying socioeconomic backgrounds and giving them a place in the order of priority within our magnet enrollment policy. And I sincerely hope this could result in our sending a message to the community and through our current SES numbers, that even though our current SE numbers are lower than the other elementary schools, this is partly due to the gentrification of our downtown area over the last 15 years. And even though some would say our school success directly correlates with the low SES numbers, it also is reflective not only of the amazing team of teachers and staff, but also of the sustaining a school culture and welcoming our community of highly involved families through the volunteerism, and that is something that is vital to every public school, but oftentimes lacking. So while there are arguments for and against all of this, none of it was intended to purposely put any family who wanted to apply at a disadvantage. And none of it was purposely intended to have a negative impact on our neighboring elementary schools. And through all of it, we, that being myself, our staff, our amazing staff of teachers, and the Sorensen Magnet School community as a whole, we recognize and would not argue that the landscape has changed. And therefore, we know our enrollment policies should also change. So with that, I emphasize several important points for your consideration that have to do with keeping the Sorensen priority zone and When what was then called the Sorensen overlay was put into place, this was a result of many families who lived within the Sorensen neighborhood and chose to apply to the school, but whose students were not selected in the lottery. We heard from them loud and clear that message that our kids want to attend Sorensen, resulting in a logical decision of allowing them a place in the priority. And because of this, the magnet overlay was added. And as a result, it addressed that issue, and it solidified and strengthened our ties with the downtown business community. And the intended overlay could be adjusted when and where necessary to hopefully capture more applicants from the immediate neighborhood, as well as continue to allow opportunity for access to interested families across our district. And don't forget, it continues to support the spirit of school choice and the arts and humanities focus. Families living nearby who choose to apply could, and those who chose not to apply still could opt out to their zone neighborhood school. What we are now calling the priority zone is vital in continuing what has been otherwise successful in meeting what the community requested in terms of neighborhood and district-wide fair opportunity for access. And to move forward without that priority zone could be considered a step backwards, and most notably being the resurgence of frustrated families who live near the school, whose children have a less chance of getting access to the school. But also to those factions of the downtown business community who dedicated their time and financial support and advocacy in turning Sorensen into a magnet school and sustaining the magnet programs for 15 years running. So the zone district with caps but no SES considerations, this is model number one with a priority zone. It allows that placement of the priority order for applicants whose attendance zone school has been designated by the superintendent as at or exceeding capacity. And this proposal seems appropriate in that it would allow priority for students who are zoned for the schools. It also allows that priority for students who are zoned for schools who are exceeding capacity but have applied to Sorensen. And the proposal creates an opportunity for Sorensen to play a role, now be able to play a role in helping to alleviate the issue of capacity for students while seeking our own unique arts and humanities programming. And then option 2 of model 1, the zone district with caps and SES consideration, allows for priority in the aforementioned caps, but also with the additional prioritization of families who qualify for free and reduced lunch up to the 35% threshold. This is the average SC number for the district, I'm assuming. In addition to all of that, the idea of possibility of added transportation also shows diligence in hopefully to improve accessibility in hopes of attracting more students from throughout the district who may otherwise not apply due to their own transportation limitations. This could be a great addition. We would also step up our advertising. Both the options here are a result of the feedback we've heard from the community and appear to address the issues of creating a more level playing field in comparison to other elementary schools in our district. And it also diversifies our student population based on free and reduced status. None of this should take away from the school focus, nor would it impact the longstanding reputation and community trust that has been a vital part of our efforts in sustaining a magnet program. And an ongoing review of our student progress would be helpful in continuing to tell the Sorensen story in a positive light. We want to do this the right way, and if given the opportunity, we accept and welcome any potential challenges that come with change in hopes of demonstrating continued success in the coming years. So thank you for allowing me to share that. I hope that some of that, if not more, is helpful to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Hey, thank you, Brett. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Depew? Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Cook, you said Ramsey, either Crystal or Aaron or both are on as well?
Yes, both Crystal and Aaron are available. And Crystal, if you're available, I'd love for you to jump in now.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us and listening to our feedback and point of view. Ramsey's a little bit different, as we know, than, there we go. Hi, everybody. Ramsey's a little different, as we know, than Sorensen. And so, especially when you look at our free and reduced population. And so I think that's where it gets a little bit tricky. And when Dr. Cook mentioned that maybe the principals don't exactly agree either, it's not that we don't agree. And Brett and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and I want to support what makes sense at both schools. But what's a little different for Ramsey is, and as we all know, is our size and our location. And I agree that we have heard from the community that attendance zones and neighborhood schools are important. But for Ramsey, that neighborhood is a little different because it's quite large, and our attendance zone or our priority zone is quite large. And so, you know, when you compare that we have 6 to 8 buses on a given year versus the 1 or 2 that are at Sorensen and that kind of thing, we don't have as many kids that can just easily walk to school and so on and so forth. And so for us, the priority zone is important, but it's not as important as it is at Sorensen. I feel it's important to have it for now, but and I am in support of that. But I think it would be worthwhile down the road as we look at attendance zones again and have the addition of other elementary schools and stuff, potentially relooking at what would it look like for magnet schools not to have a priority zone. You know, when Ramsey was first developed years ago as a magnet school, it didn't have priority zones. It wasn't until the school district got larger that we changed the process. And it used to just be that it was staff members' children, and then siblings, and then everybody else. And so I think it would be worthwhile to still consider that down the road. One thing that's interesting for us at Ramsey is some of our more supportive families and parents that can support in ways such as fundraising and other ways as that are all parents that opt in that do not live in our priority zone for the most part. And I might be overgeneralizing just a little bit, but I know that's completely different than what the case is at Sorensen. And I just want to make sure that we stay true to being a magnet at Ramsey. And I know that's the goal of everybody in this meeting. But I just, with our size and the priority zone, the way that it is, and a lot of kids just coming to Ramsey because they can get on a bus and come to Ramsey and not necessarily just because of the STEM focus. I just want to make sure that the model that we go with can help stay true to our STEM focus at Ramsey. And so to echo what Brett shared for Sorensen, we have talked, and I agree with his recommendations and sentiments for what works for Sorensen, and we can make that work at Ramsey as well. But like I said, I would be interested in down the road as we look at attendance zones and stuff again to see what it looked like for maybe just Ramsey and not Sorensen, but Ramsey not to potentially have a priority zone.
So they were, I guess, at one point strictly lottery then?
Yes. Oh gosh, when it was first developed,
15
trying to
years.
think, about 10 years ago, we were strictly lottery. And at that point, the district was still allowing out of district kids to even come in. They were lower on the lottery chain per se, but out of district kids were even allowed to come in at that point because our enrollment was so much lower. It wasn't until Winton moved back to the original site after it was remodeled that we looked at changing the process to have a priority zone, because it was affecting Winton's enrollment so greatly by them being our only overlay school that we were feeding into as well. So we still did provide busing when we were lottery only, but it just was by chance that if you got in and you lived in the busing zone, then you got a bus, but you weren't prioritized by any means.
Crystal, I have a question for you. Is part of your concern or maybe desire to look at something other than a priority zone because of how big Ramsey's priority zone is, and if there was a consideration to reduce it in size, keeping with that neighborhood idea? Because I know part of the overlay right now is not really conducive to a neighborhood walking distance type of school. Would that be more palatable? I mean, I'm not, and I know you're a team player here, I'm hearing that without question, but is that something that you would ask us to consider or look at?
Yes, I think that would be worth consideration. I will say though, that I know that our priority zone, sorry, I need to get used to calling it different. Our priority zone does help with our free and reduced numbers though, so I recognize that as well. Because our priority zone does happen to have some of our pockets of neighborhoods that struggle a little bit more. And so with that said, I know that's a goal and that we need to keep our free and reduced numbers where they're at, because we hover right in between 35% to 40%, right around the district average. So if we do look at adjusting the priority zone, I would want to be mindful of ensuring that we're keeping some of those neighborhoods so that we could keep our free and reduced numbers where they're at. I also, I mean, truly, because I was on the committee that started Ramsey as a magnet years ago, and so I just also know that a true magnet is typically more of a lottery focus, and that's what occurs nationwide. And you know, I just think it's worth a conversation at some point to be looking back at what a true magnet is at some point. But I don't know. I know the location and the size of Ramsey and the effect of other schools and Skyway and all that kind of stuff. It's a bigger conversation than something we need to be doing right now. And that's why I said maybe just down the road in the future, we look at that again.
So if I heard you correctly earlier, when you were a pure lottery, you felt that people, obviously they wanted to go to Ramsey because of your focus, and maybe you're not seeing that as much now as when we switch to priority zones, that people are just going to Ramsey, you know, because our buses reach them and it's where they're at. Is
correct? Yes. Excuse me, sorry. Yes, and also we've, and rightly so, because of the overcrowding at other schools, we've also had sections that have just been given to us from other areas and things like that, which, like I said, we'll gladly take all students, but then that quickly you know, also just adds more families that maybe aren't there for the magnet focus, but just there because that's where they need to go.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. Any other questions, board members, for Crystal? Okay.
I have a general question though, Dr. Cook, and the one thing now thinking back about it and hearing Crystal's questions is the priority zone is not addressed in the initial policy that we looked at, and if it's something that we're opting towards, there's probably something that needs to be included in that policy on how it will be managed, administered, adapted to whatever the goals are. So maybe moving forward, if we go that direction, then the actual creation of a new priority zone for both schools needs to be discussed as far as size, how many people or how many students are drawn from that, what make it of the school. I know we're working on the 50-50 model, but that's something that could be included in policy to help with some of the issues that we've experienced currently with our magnet schools.
So I think there's actually two questions that just brought up, of which one, yours is one, and that is, you know, the whole purpose of a priority zone is to prioritize students in that location. So I still think that defining of that lives in this what is it, policy 3112, or the procedure of 3112, probably more likely. But the second one, which I heard her say several times, is what is truly the purpose of the magnet school? What are they there to serve? And I think if you could go back in time and ask both of those questions for Sorensen folks, staff and students and parents and everybody, and Ramsey the same way, is why do you intend to declare what it is that you wish to declare? And one of the things that it struck me is maybe a little more build out in policy 9810 as to defining the why of who you are, and not just do it retroactively for the two that we have, but also in consideration of if there is a new one. But it strikes me that both of those circumstances are probably missing from our policy work right now. And I think that's the kind of feedback we were hoping for tonight, is to, once we could narrow into the scope of what it is that we were looking at, then we could start to more robustly build out that language so that that's captured and provides the board the authority and the tools they need to make those modifications and changes as required to maintain enrollment balance, to maintain a level of expectation balance, SES balance, those kinds of things that is really the task of the board to govern over and for our administration to deliver upon.
I think that was a good comment, Miss May. It's kind of captured in there a little bit, but could certainly be expanded upon. It talks about if there is, the board may provide priority to someone in a attendance zone or a magnet priority zone, whatever it is. I have a couple questions for you, Dr. Cook, on these, or I at least have one question in it. It talks about transportation, and it's in both, either option 1 and option 2. Let's see here. Of course, now I can't find it. Yeah, it's right after the windows. Oh, yeah, there it is. It is on page 8 of 3012. And under transportation, it says busing will be available to all magnet school students residing within the district's boundaries. And is that a mistake?
It is not. Believe it or not, that caused so many arguments. It is just as simply as if by state statute, if somebody can get to a bus stop, we're required to transport them. And that is a discussion that has gone on and on and on. Because we haven't had to be in that situation in some regards. It doesn't mean that you have to put a bus stop in every location in the community, but it does require that if anybody, even out of district students that are somehow in our district attending, if they can get to a bus stop that transports to any one of our schools and that's their school, we're required to transport them. And so one of the things that I think is going to be now easier for us to discuss is what role does transportation have in both magnet schools? Because in a true magnet model, you don't usually have transportation. And transportation is absolutely a tool that the board could consider for us to implement to help with both balancing enrollment, balancing SES, and being a tool that the board can influence how kids get to each of our schools.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Given what you just told me, to me, that paragraph needs some work, or that section needs some work to establish that, because to me, that says to any established bus stop.
No, it's referenced, I think, in the first policy to a designated bus stop, if you can get to the designated district bus stop. I saw that.
Yeah, so maybe just some clarification about, to an established bus stop for that school. Like, that's not, well, I got my kid to a Hayden Meadows bus stop, and you've got to figure out how to get them to Sorensen. The other, I guess my comments just on these policies, and I'm not going to say a whole lot more tonight, I don't think, but still, even hearing the feedback, I think, and I think it's option 1 would be my preference for our existing schools to go, to move forward, and I think it's just too cumbersome to try to roll 2 options down the track at the same time, but I think there's some validity in looking at coming back with option 2 as, something that a school could opt into, and I'm envisioning it more for a new magnet school that comes down along the lines, but maybe the Ramsey folks get together and their school community supports something like that, and they come and petition the board and they say, we'd like to switch from a this to a that. And, and really the district has to have some say in that, right? Because that may not work for the district. If all of a sudden Ramsey doesn't want an attendance zone, we've got to figure that out for a bunch of kids that we just don't have seats for. So
I want to make sure I understand what you're asking for, because I would assume that we would want to include language in the policy that provides that authority to the magnet schools to come and have that consideration with the board and that discussion. And so therefore the policy,
creating a new policy. So I would be totally comfortable with doing that down the road. In regard to within option 1, kind of the 2 options, is there SES considerations or not? I think for me, my concern is it just too cumbersome to add those additional requirements? And can we achieve the goals of the school and the district by increasing transportation availability and massaging those magnet priority zones, meaning you move the magnet priority zones, keeping the local area, but maybe you're expanding it here or you're expanding it there. I think Brett talked about the Coeur d'Alene downtown area, and it's changed from what it was 15 years ago. And so, I just wonder, is it too big of a jump, and are we ready, and can we adequately handle kind of all those additional layers? So that would be my feedback, I guess, is that I would be okay with not the SES requirements in there. I'm okay either way, but I guess I'm concerned that it's just going to be difficult for us to manage.
So I want to make sure, so you're saying, first of all, we're saying Model 1, which includes the magnet priority zone, and you're saying option 1 of Model 1 seems cumbersome. Is that correct? No. Option 2 seems cumbersome.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's what Casey Morster was saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Dr. Cook, I had a question. I thought you raised a really good point. We really thought about the purpose of our magnet schools, and I think both of the principals did a really nice job, because it is different for every school. Broadly speaking, though, as a district and as a board, what is the purpose of our magnet schools? And it seems we've heard a lot of conversation about magnet programs offering programs that aren't available at a traditional school, and that may draw certain families from the north, the south, the east, and the west. And for that reason, I had some concern about using capacity as a lever for entrance to a school. And I wondered if there was a validity to it, because we have so much overcapacity in certain regions. Why should a family be disadvantaged if they've moved into an area where we've seen robust growth and we haven't been able to keep up with facilities? Is that a reason why that student or family should not be able to attend one of our magnet schools? And I had a real sticking point with that for me, and I wonder if it could be challenged, because many of our magnet schools, including Ramsey, are running way over capacity, but yet it is a magnet school. And so for me, that had heartburn, because I didn't think it was fair if there's a student, that the arts and humanities are what they live for, and do they deserve equal access to that school? It's not their fault that their current school is overcrowded. And I think it also sets up a situation where we know where our mostly our least enrollment is occurring, and it's in our southern schools right now. We know it was a challenge through the rebounding process, and so we're basically saying to those families, well, this program might work for you, but you live at a school that has room, so therefore you have to stay there. I think that's disingenuous, and I don't think it embodies why we're creating magnet schools as a whole. So I'd like us to find a lever or a tool to improve SES or accessibility through the overlay or busing or advertising. But capacity, to me, because it's so variable, and we had such a hard time even nailing down capacity at every school. Some people say it's not a capacity, some say it is, some are using portables, some aren't. True capacity right now for us is still a moving target. Maybe in 5 to 10 years that would be a more valuable or steady way to look at it. But what if a school is one person over capacity, and you deem that school over capacity, and therefore no one in that zone has access to any of our magnet schools? To me, that was a difficult, and the fact that it changed annually for the community, there wouldn't be a lot of consistency as to what to expect about who has access to our magnet schools. So that piece gave me heartburn, and so I'd be open to hearing if there was a different way that you thought we could achieve the same purpose without preventing certain pockets of our community to having access to our magnet schools.
Yeah, no, I think that's really valid feedback. And I think the part of this that gets to be a challenge is when you wind up with, you can wind up with circumstances in which you have both happening at the same time, in which you have a school that is way over capacity, so their need or their opportunity for access to, if you have some number of students that want access to a program, and then you have this, let's say you have 50 kids wanting out of Skyway to go to Ramsey to have STEM, and you have 50 kids wanting out of Bryan Elementary who's just barely making enrollment work at that level, at that staffing level. So then you wind up with a conversation about how do you administer that. And I think that's the part of this conversation that right now we haven't necessarily dove into, because a priority zone has some some repercussions that it has, kind of like my Goofy Maverick example. I think if you brought folks from Bryan or Fernan or even potentially Winton in, Winton for two, right? Because Winton is hit by both Ramsey and Sorensen. And so I think the uniqueness is that kids are getting pulled out of those schools, whether it's by programming or it's by location. And the view from the lens on the sending school might be very different, whereas Skyway is just overloaded with kids. So there's not a big pushback when we say let those kids go. But maybe in Bryan or Fernan, where they're a pretty small school that are highly impacted by those kids leaving, the opinions there might be vastly different. And I think that's when we talk about capacity as a leveraging tool, it isn't necessarily to punish or to it's just as a tool for the board to use as maybe if 175 students came out of one school all wanting to attend one of our magnet schools, would we allow that? Well, if you don't consider capacity, you could be making fatal decisions for schools. That's all. Not necessarily that it would become a moving target, but those considerations matter.
I think it'd be equally important to consider if we put stipulations on access to our magnet schools, we have to consider the same set of guidelines for open enrollment policy, because as we've discussed in the past, the same situations are happening when people are trying to transfer from one school to the next. And so if we're going to say as a board, and who knows if we're going to, we value SES and we value schools over capacity, we would have to then, it seems to me, carry forward the same guidelines if a student wanted to open enroll from, let's say, Bryan to Dalton, an under capacity school to a school that's at capacity, but or has spots through the open enrollment process, because then you'd be creating a situation that really was not equitable for the community. And I think some community members would be really frustrated by that.
I think that's a great example of how I think we're eventually going to get to some different equity conversations. But I would say that the very first, we've made that change with the policy we adopted a couple of months ago, which now creates, you can always go to your home school, because it also, by doing that, it also creates if we're over capacity in a school, all those that have choiced in now become the first that have to come out, which does balance in that regard. So it does provide the board some tools to kind of level that. And so that to me makes a lot of sense overall in both policies. When you're talking about choice has to make sense for the district too, or the district or the board can't govern based upon the demand, right?
What about putting kind of caps on the numbers of students that could come out of a building? Is that something you guys discussed at all? And what issues do you see with that?
We have discussed it. It's probably a lever that could be implemented, but won't by itself solve the problems. It's going to have to be done, I would assume, with things like additional transportation and other reference points. It does make sense. It becomes more challenging when a school is close geographically to other schools, because a magnet school that's close to another school will pull those kids because it's close. And people are driven by, number one, convenience and access. Absolutely it is. Even in a choice situation, people are much happier when that's a block away than it is when it's 6 miles away. And I think that's the part that we tend to struggle with, because Ramsey is so large, because there's so many kids that are so close to it geographically, but we don't feel it, for example, at Skyway or at Winton, because there's so many kids that can come out of those schools that it's not considered, and I don't want to minimize this isn't meant to sound this way, but it's not as much of a loss, because we've got to, when you have 700 kids, you're trying to figure out where they're going to go to school. 10 of them leaving helps solve the problem. But it makes good sense to set some kind of parameters that doesn't overburden any one school with those challenges.
Yeah, and if you could look at, like on page 11, some of that language in there that was schools that are negatively impacted by magnet schools, if we could look at that language, because I think that begins to lead us down the magnet school negatively impacts, instead of just it impacts, but it maybe shines a wrong light on what that impact is. The caps and to piggyback off of what Lisa, Miss May said, it did feel cumbersome to have it change every year. And I know we need to maybe look at that as our numbers go, but I think knowing what to expect, knowing that if I live here, it just needs to be clear as we dig into that some more, so.
I'd like to ask a little clarification. If it was a general trend of enrollment, rather than a year-to-year spike up, down, 1 or 2 kids, but general trends in schools that we see increasing enrollment, does that, I think is that still problematic? I'm looking for language clarity here. Is it about the philosophy of using capacity as a trigger, or is it about the inability to predict what that looks like?
For me, it's a philosophy, and it comes back to we haven't defined what our ultimate or our end philosophy is for magnet schools, but in my view, they should have equal access through a fair and equal lottery system. And so taking away part of that group and says you don't get access because you live in an overcrowded area doesn't fit into what, that's just me speaking, what my perception of a robust magnet policy would look like. In the equity framework, it would be every student has equal access. Parameters, levers could be put on, but
I hear what you're saying. I just wonder, we're kind of down that rabbit hole already, right? Because we're giving people preference that live in a certain area, right? That live in that neighborhood, that preferred zone. Well, you're taking away from someone else, right?
Help
'Cause
me
if you're giving them
understand, Lisa,
preference.
where you see it. I'm confused taking away. Because the priority to me is given an option. It's not taking away the option. So I'm trying to follow your
like,
concern.
for instance, if we looked at our schools that are not currently over capacity, right? We know that Fernan, Bryan, Bora, depending on how many transfers they get, Hayden Meadows, Dr. Cook could potentially say at the beginning of every calendar year, these schools have been deemed under capacity and therefore they're not eligible for applying in the Sorensen lottery. Or if their name was drawn and they went ahead and applied, you didn't deny access. If they were drawn, they would be set aside because they attended a school that was not at capacity. It had room or space available.
I see what you're saying. And I guess I see the priorities as saying students from other schools are going to have a first crack, but it's not preventing students from the non-capacity schools from applying. It's just putting them behind other students. So I hear what you're saying. It just helped me clarify, because I thought you were saying the priority actually said they couldn't apply at all. But I think we're saying the same
They
thing.
can
just
apply, they will
differently.
just be shuffled a lot lower
Yeah.
than someone
Yeah.
that lives in a more crowded
Okay.
area. And then I think we also, especially for our downtown, for Sorensen, that would basically take away all neighboring schools, except for those people that lived in the small priority zone. So our schools that would be ineligible, those kids, many of them could walk, and many of them do walk because Bryan and Sorensen are so close, for instance. And Fernan, those zones, we're talking about 0.5 miles. So many of those kids don't even take the bus. I mean, they don't even barely fill up one bus at Sorensen. So I think if that population can no longer apply to a school, I don't know that that's fair access anymore.
Well, and what I don't want to see the priorities do is overwhelm what the whole magnet school purpose is, which I think is what Crystal was talking about, which is what we had a lot of dialogue about with regards to attendance zones. We didn't want an attendance zone to override the general population's ability to come there by choice. And so I would be, I'm on a little different page than Casey in that I would like to see the SES unless I'm told by admin that it is not possible or uber cumbersome. I like to see that piece in there, but I am not as convinced that the exceeding capacity piece should be another priority. Those are my thoughts, and I'm still obviously open. But I would definitely be with option 1, and I would lean towards how did we put these?
It's option 2 of option 1. Yeah.
Model 1, option
Model
2.
1,
B. Right.
Model 1, option 2, but a modified option 2.
Dr. Cook, is there a reason why there wasn't an option for just SES without capacity? Because capacity is woven into both of the options. Was there a reason behind that, or just?
Yeah, we can do whatever you guys want. Yeah, ultimately what we're trying to do with the language is provide all the buttons that the board can push to say, okay, we need to balance enrollment, or we need to control enrollment better. We're getting pockets of tremendous growth in some areas, and we're getting pockets of tremendous poverty in some areas that we have an obligation in the community to administer to. And our goal is to try to find the right language that gives you the tools, whether that's transportation, whether that's setting caps on the number of kids that can come out of any one school, or or capacity, for example. Caps and capacity are arguably two different things. Or whether we just do a weighted lottery that gives a student coming from poverty a better shot at getting in than somebody that's not from poverty. And some of those are like borderline, is that fair and reasonable? And I think that's the question that we get into, is when you start talking about balancing choice and options, you live in that fine line about not controlling choice so much that you destroy the programming and the desire and the parental communication, the parental involvement. But you still, ultimately the best form of that, and I don't want to sound offensive on this, but the best form of that is a private school, which everybody chooses that option and they all buy into that by doing it with their financial resources. As a public school and as a district, we have an obligation to try to provide that choice with some boundaries and limitations on it, and whether that's with caps or capacity or a weighted lottery. Those are the things we're trying to do, but ultimately it's you guys will agree to the policy that you feel like we should be supporting, and so we're looking for the language that gives you that access to those tools that can help us provide that.
Thank you. Ms. Brumley, I just want to clarify, I heard you right. So you were Model 1, Option 2, minus the capacity lever, if you will. Okay. And how do others, I think Ms. May, I maybe heard you in support of that, something along that lines?
Yeah, same, actually, so.
You two are the same as that?
And Tambra.
Oh, so, okay.
I'm fine with that. Moving that forward and getting more feedback.
Yeah.
Those Model 1, Option 2, which is the one that has the SES factors in there, but it remove the capacity factor that you were talking about. Yeah, is it priority group 6? And it may have some other that change something else. Not sure how 5 and 7 are different. One's within the zone, one's without of the zone. Yeah.
I have a quick question about the out of district, because are we currently taking any K-5 students out of district, Dr. Cook? And so is that just for future in the case? Okay.
Yeah, we do have some kids grandfathered, but we aren't accepting any new out of district, but that doesn't preclude us from doing it in the future, right? So there's no reason to not include it in the policy.
I had one little tweak to consider, and this goes back to 3012. Make sure which is just the enrollment standards. When you go down to page 2 of that, which is page 6 on my board book, where it says, with respect to all magnet lottery systems, the board desires, and it sets out priority as staff members, child, siblings, and the magnet priority zone. The one thing I was concerned about with the siblings was that we have made it clear in the procedure, the 3012Ps, that the siblings are within magnet priority and in district. And that section didn't clarify that. And so I just wanted to make sure that we're consistent through those. Because just to say you're a sibling, but say they move out of district and now they're asking for priority based on that, I think is inconsistent with the other priority sections. Are you following me? No. Do you know where I'm at?
No, actually, I was just writing notes. So.
Okay. Do you know where I'm at?
I couldn't figure where you're at either. If,
But I
So you're on
think-
3012, page 2.
Page 2 at the bottom.
But I think that is a question to clarify. So what you're hypothesizing is if a family moves out of district, not out of the priority zone, but out of district, do they still have priority? And I'm not sure about that.
They don't. They don't in what is articulated in 3012P. I'm clarifying an inconsistency between where we've stated in two different places.
But
And so,
we do have students, Dr. Cook, don't we? Didn't you just say that we still are being grandfathered that are out of district?
Yes, so we have students that are, the question I think that we're talking about is whether or not if I'm a fifth grader, we move out of district and I finish my fifth grade year and now I'm now a sixth grader and I go to Post Falls, whatever, does my kindergarten little brother or little sister get to enroll as, or to get treated as a sibling that would be prioritized because we once lived in, for example, the priority zone?
But what if the person's in third grade and they move outside of the district, and they have a sibling? So the current student gets to stay, but does the sibling get the priority if they're out of district? Jen's saying no.
I'm saying, I thought I read our P to say no.
That's the way I would interpret, we've interpreted it,
Okay,
and I
perfect,
think that's what we should probably capture as at least a starting point for the language.
And it's in there, it's just different in two spots. So if you go
Okay.
to 3012, page 2, not the P, but just 3012 itself, which has enrollment standards, on the second page, it does the 3 bullets of the priority. The second bullet just says, the applicant has a sibling currently attending the magnet school. That should be qualified and still lives within the priority zone or in district.
So Annie and Megan, nod if you understand.
I see Megan over
Yep.
there.
All right, that's all I want to make sure of.
We gotcha.
this it can be a little challenging at times to read it with all the strikes and all those sorts of things. So if possible, as we're moving forward, if we could maybe get rid of the first version and maybe we're just seeing what we saw tonight, and the next one would be nice. There's in 3012P, if you take out the strikes, there's kind of a wonky sentence there where it almost repeats itself. It's in 2 different paragraphs, but if you took out all the strikes, they're right next to each other. It's in the the one that starts off, parents or guardians must submit an application for each new student, and then if you took out all the strikes, the next sentence says all new students must complete the new student application.
Yeah. So let us in this next version simplify this, kind of start. I think we need to just put all this into the record so that it's all recorded and we've got all the changes that have happened over time. But let's start off with kind of a newer version. So it's we're all struggling a little bit with that, and you would not believe the number of requests we've gotten for just, can we have a non-redlined copy just so we can read it? Right.
But Dr. Cook, please tell your team thank you. They have done so much work on this policy, and I think we're inching closer.
Yeah, I think we're getting it boxed in. We're sneaking up on it from all sides, and we just get closer and closer every time we meet. So thank you for that feedback, and we'll eventually get to it.
I do think, if possible, I know it's summertime, so it's hard to communicate with folks, but maybe just getting something in the hands of particularly the Sorensen folks that didn't appear to be on this, in my opinion, on the same page as where we were, or didn't understand where we're at, and probably because it's just it's a little more drawn out process than we typically use when we look at policy. That just, hey, here's what we're doing, and this is why, and this is when things are going to take place, and we're going to keep you in the loop. We're not going to surprise them one day and just, hey, you don't have a zone anymore, sorry, or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think now that we've narrowed kind of the language, I think it's time that we probably say, all right, folks, we've gotten a lot closer on this. Let's start re-engaging in the conversation. Here's where things are. Remember what your guarantees are. None of this is even applicable this year. It's stuff for the future, and it's policy that we'll be implementing over time. And But I would say that I think we've come a long ways when you consider that some of this was brand new and didn't even exist, and we were just living based upon an application process. So I'm proud of our team's kind of our process to go back and build it after the fact, and I think that's the part that's made this one much more challenging and difficult to get all of the pieces to. But we can communicate that out after we start getting this narrowed. So thank you.
Okay.
Dr. Cook, can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Of course.
So I think Trustee May and a few other trustees mentioned that they wanted some more, I'll use the word texture, to the overlay zone creation. So I was hoping, and I don't know if I just didn't hear it totally, but if the board could just look at the definition of magnet priority zones, what I heard, because I'm just looking on when we go to rewrite what, it's kind of hidden in the definition, and it sounds like maybe it needs to be in the body and have some more teeth. There were some factors included on what the board might want to consider when first deciding whether or not to make a priority zone, including that the board would control the boundary and when they could adjust it, and that there would be a formal review periodically, but not less than 3 years. Could the trustees maybe weigh in one more time on what they're looking for with that first creation of the zone and revisiting that issue?
Yeah, Megan, I'm reading it, and I think because we're also familiar with the magnet priority zone now, we understand it, and it's kind of implied what you're meaning. But I think if it was just more specific, that it will be reevaluated at whatever term the district sees fit, and that it will be used as a tool for equalizing whatever factors that we feel like need addressing, and that the superintendent, I mean, is it a board or superintendent, then, yeah, a board decision to update it or evaluate it as needed. But I think it also probably then needs to be in the following policy someplace, just all incorporated. I'm not sure where it would go, but.
Lisa, are you thinking
I think
terms
we can
maybe?
fix that, yeah.
Sorry, Megan, as specific as maybe considerations being walkability, maintaining neighborhood schools, SES,
Number of
those kinds
students
of
it may
things, so that people
produce.
so future boards can actually know what we meant about what we wanted to look at in priority zones.
Because I think Crystal's comments were great. You know, their priority zone is way too large for them right now, and it's hindering or hampering the true benefit of the magnet school. So maybe we decide, you know, what is the really good ratio? Is it 70-30, you know, 30% in the preferred or priority zone, 70% out? What is that? And maybe it's different for every school. Maybe that's also something that comes in recommendation with their application. I don't know, but
I would think over time, as we address, you know, hopefully, Ramsey's size with additional, you know, permanent structures, classroom space, you know, hopefully that'll kind of re-engage. My guess would be if we talk to any of our schools that are 700 elementary kids, there's a lot of kids that or families that become unengaged, right? They get lost in the system a little bit. And so hopefully if we can get Ramsey back to a 550 or something, maybe they've got a more passionate base out of 550, and the reason they lose some of that 700 is just because you start losing people. It's easier to blend in the crowd and be unengaged. I don't know. Right. Okay.
Are you guys good? Megan and Annie, you guys? Yep. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we missed my estimate by almost a good hour, so I'm getting bad at this. But why don't we go ahead and we'll adjourn, and we're back here next Monday.